At roughly 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, a family climbed out of an upstairs window on a narrow London lane and edged along the guttering to the house next door. There were 4 of them, a baker named Thomas Farriner, his son, his daughter, and 1 servant. The servant was a maid. She would not follow them onto the roof. We do not know what stopped her, whether it was the drop or the dark, or the fact that the tiles were already too hot to kneel on. We do not know her name. No record kept it. She stayed in the window, and she became the first person to die in the Great Fire of London. Here is the part that should unsettle you. When the fire finally burned out 4 days later, after it had consumed 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and 4/5 of the walled city, the official death toll was 6, in a fire that made 100,000 people homeless. We'll come back to that number because it may be the most misleading figure in English history. But the mystery of that night is not who started the fire. We know who started it. It began in Farriner's bakehouse, and everyone at the time agreed on that within hours. The real question is stranger. London burned constantly. House fires were so routine that every parish stored firefighting gear in its church porch, and every citizen knew the drill. In an average year, the city put out dozens of them. It had been doing this successfully for 500 years. So why did this one bakery on one back lane, on one ordinary Saturday night, win? Picture the street. It is barely wide enough for a cart. On both sides, the buildings lean toward each other because each upper floor is jettied, built out a foot or two beyond the one below to steal square footage from the air. Stack 4 stories of that and the top rooms nearly touch across the road. On some lanes, neighbours could shake hands out of their attic windows. The frames are oak. The gaps are filled with lath and plaster. The exteriors are coated in pitch and tar to keep out the rain, which is to say, coated in fuel. There are no street numbers. You navigate by painted signs hanging on iron brackets over your head. A sugar loaf, a bell, a mermaid. Down the middle of the road runs the kennel, an open gutter carrying whatever the household has thrown out. And the smell is coal. London burned sea coal shipped down from Newcastle, and it hung over the city in a permanent brown haze. 5 years earlier, the diarist John Evelyn had written an entire pamphlet begging the king to do something about the smoke, describing a city where you could not see across a street and where the sun looked sickly through it. The lane where the fire started was called Pudding Lane, named not for dessert but for the puddings, the offal, carted down it from the butchers of Eastcheap to the dung boats on the Thames. That lane runs downhill to the river, and what was stored along the river is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Now go inside and understand how these people lived. Most Londoners did not have a bedroom. A family of 6 might occupy 1 or 2 rooms. Apprentices slept in the garret, or on a truckle bed pulled out at night, or on the shop-falsed floor beside the counter they worked at all day. Beds were shared as a matter of course. They ate bread at nearly every meal, coarse rye and barley loaves for the poor, white manshi for those who could afford it, with cheese, pottage, salt fish and oysters, which were cheap enough to be a labourer's food. They drank small beer rather than water, because the beer was safer. Those without a hearth of their own bought hot food from cook shops, and every single night they did the same thing before sleeping. They banked the fire, raked the embers together, and covered them with ash so the coals would survive until morning. The word for it is older than the practice: couvre-feu, cover fire, curfew. Which means that London did not go to sleep with its fires out. London went to sleep every night with tens of thousands of fires still alive inside it, deliberately kept that way. And one household in the city had a professional reason to keep its fire hotter than anyone else's. Thomas Farriner baked ship's biscuit for the Royal Navy. He held a royal contract and the Navy was at war, so his oven ran hard. Bakers worked at night by necessity. London wanted bread in the morning, so the ovens were fired in the small hours. That is the whole reason there was a roaring fire on Pudding Lane at 1 in the morning. The city's appetite set the schedule. Farrier would insist for the rest of his life that this was not his fault. He testified that he had raked out the oven himself, that he checked the bakehouse before bed, and that there was not enough live coal left to have done it. He may even have been telling the truth. Fires in bakehouses did not usually start in the oven. They started in what surrounded it, flour dust, kindling stacked to dry, and timber walls that had been slowly baking for years until they would catch from heat alone. But the summer of 1666 had another ingredient. There had been almost no meaningful rain since the previous autumn. The city was in drought. Every beam, every shingle, every pitch-coated wall had been drying out for 10 months. So a fire starts. Fine. London put out fires all the time. There was a system. Why didn't the system work? Here is the system. Parish churches stored leather buckets, ladders, brass squirts that held about a quart of water, and fire hooks, long poles with iron claws used to pull the burning house down. That last one is the important one. 17th century firefighting was not really about water. It was about demolition. Tear down the buildings in the fire's path, make a gap, starve it. Done early, it worked almost every time. By 3 in the morning, the fire had spread from the bakehouse to an inn and along the lane. Someone sent for the Lord Mayor. His name was Sir Thomas Bloodworth, and this was the decision the entire night turned on. Bloodworth arrived, looked at it, and refused to order demolition. Samuel Pepys recorded the words he was reported to have used, that a woman might put it out by pissing on it, and went back to bed. It's easy to hear that as pure stupidity. It wasn't entirely. Bloodworth had a real problem. If he pulled down houses, the city could be liable to compensate the owners, and the law was murky about whether he could act without the owner's consent. Landlords were often absent. He was a merchant, not a soldier, and he was being asked to destroy other people's property at 3 in the morning on his own authority. So he hesitated, and the wind was blowing hard from the east. In the hours he spent hesitating, the fire reached the one street in London it should never have been allowed to touch. Pudding Lane runs downhill to the Thames, and along the waterfront ran the warehouses. This is where London kept the things a port city keeps: pitch, tar, hemp, cordage, oil, tallow, brandy, sugar, timber, and heaps of coal on the wharves. Every one of those is an accelerant. The fire came down the hill and found them. That is the moment an ordinary house fire became something else. The heat generated on Thames Street was enough to start throwing burning debris ahead of itself onto rooftops, which meant fire breaks stopped mattering. The fire could now jump the gaps that were supposed to stop it. And then it took out the water. London's piped water came partly from water wheels mounted in the arches at the north end of London Bridge, pumping Thames water through hollowed elm trunks into the city. The fire reached the bridge end early and burned the wheels. Elsewhere, panicking citizens dug up and hacked open the wooden mains to get at water directly, and drained the pressure out of the system for everyone downstream. Within a few hours of dawn, London was fighting the largest fire in its history with less water than it had on a normal Tuesday. Meanwhile, one man was crossing the river to wake up the king. Samuel Pepys was a senior naval administrator, and his diary is why we can reconstruct that Sunday almost hour by hour. His maid, Jane Birch, woke him around 3 in the morning to say she could see a fire in the city. Pepys looked out, decided it was far enough away, and, this detail is very human, went back to sleep. When he got up properly, he climbed a turret at the Tower of London and understood immediately that this was different. He took a boat out onto the river and watched people trying to save what they owned, hauling goods down to the waterfront, loading them into lighters, throwing possessions into the water. He noticed that many refused to leave until the flames actually touched them. He wrote about pigeons that would not abandon their nests, hovering around the eaves until their wings burned. Then he did the most useful thing anyone did that day. He went to Whitehall and told the king. Charles II's response was immediate and correct. Pull down houses, aggressively, ahead of the fire. Pepys carried the order back to Bloodworth, who by now was overwhelmed. He told Pepys he was pulling houses down as fast as he could and the fire was outrunning him, and then went home. The king's brother James, Duke of York, effectively took over. He set up command posts, brought in soldiers, and began using gunpowder to blow gaps in the streets, which actually worked and which was the single most effective thing anyone did all week. It was Sunday evening. The fire had 3 more days to run. And what happened to St. Paul's would give London an image it never forgot. By Tuesday, old St. Paul's Cathedral was considered one of the safest places in London. It was stone. It was enormous. Its crypt, St. Faith's, had been packed with the entire stock of the city's booksellers. The trade clustered around the churchyard, and they had moved everything inside for safekeeping. The cathedral was also, at that moment, covered in wooden scaffolding for repairs. The scaffolding caught. The roof was lead, and the lead melted and ran. Evelyn described it flowing down the streets in streams, and the heated stone began to split and burst. The floor gave way into the crypt, and the bookseller's entire inventory went up beneath it. Losses there alone were reckoned in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. Outside the walls, at Moorfields and Islington, tens of thousands of people were camped in open fields with whatever they had carried. Charles II rode out to them personally, partly to hand out bread and partly because of what was spreading faster than the fire. Rumours, and they were about to kill a man. You have to understand what Londoners had already lived through. The previous year, plague had killed something like 1/5 of the city, tens of thousands of people in living memory in those same streets. England was at war with the Dutch and the French. Just 2 weeks before the fire, an English raiding force had burned a Dutch merchant fleet and a Dutch town onto shelling. And the year itself was 1666, a number that a great many people had been preaching about for decades, for obvious reasons. So when the city started burning, almost nobody's first thought was accident. Mobs formed and went hunting for foreigners and Catholics. There are accounts of French and Dutch residents being beaten in the street on suspicion of throwing fireballs. And then a man confessed. Robert Hubert was a French watchmaker from Rouen. He was picked up in Essex and confessed to starting the fire deliberately. His story changed repeatedly. He first said he had done it in Westminster, the wrong part of London entirely, then adjusted to Pudding Lane. Observers thought he was not of sound mind. Several officials openly doubted him. He was hanged anyway in October 1666. Afterwards, the captain of the ship Hubert had travelled on came forward and testified that Hubert had not even been in England when the fire started. He had arrived 2 days later. Which brings us back to 6. 6 is the number of deaths in the standard account, and it has always sat oddly against 13,000 destroyed houses. Historians have offered reasons to doubt it. The dead of the poor were often not recorded at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. The parish registers that would have recorded them were themselves burning. The elderly, the sick, and the immobile were exactly the people least able to get out of a fast-moving fire, and exactly the people least likely to be counted. There is also physical evidence about the conditions. Excavations near Pudding Lane recovered pottery that had been deformed and fused by heat far beyond an ordinary house fire, the kind of temperature you get in a kiln, not a hearth. That said, honesty matters more than drama here. No mass of remains has ever been found, and there is no historical consensus on a higher figure, is the reason the city never burned like that again. Christopher Wren submitted a plan for a rebuilt London within about a week. Grand avenues, piazzas, a rational geometry. So did Evelyn. So did others. Every one of them was rejected, for a reason that is almost boring. Property. Thousands of Londoners owned specific plots on specific streets, and redrawing the map meant litigating all of it, while 100,000 people slept in fields. Speed beat vision. London was rebuilt largely on its medieval street plan, but the rebuilding act that followed did the unglamorous work. External walls in brick or stone, no more jetties, flat frontages so buildings could not lean into each other, standardised house types by street width, some streets widened, some alleys removed. And within about 15 years, a developer named Nicholas Barban opened the first serious fire insurance business in England, and insurers, having a financial stake in buildings not burning, began funding fire brigades. The modern fire service grows out of that commercial self-interest. They also built the monument, near where Farriner's Bakehouse had stood. In 1681, during another wave of anti-Catholic panic, an inscription was added to it, blaming the fire on a popish conspiracy. It stayed carved into that stone for nearly 150 years, and was finally chiselled off in 1830. So what actually burned London? Not a spark. Sparks were the one thing that city had in abundance and had always survived. London burned because of a long series of decisions that were each, on their own, completely reasonable. Build in timber, because timber is what you can afford. Overhang the upper floor, because space is money. Keep the fire banked overnight, because relighting is a nuisance. Store the pitch by the river, because that's where it lands. Don't tear down a man's house without his consent, because that is what the law says, and the law is there for good reasons. Every one of those choices was rational. Together, they were a city built to burn, waiting only for a dry summer and an east wind. And when it happened, the first instinct was to look for a person to blame, and they found one and hanged him, and it changed nothing. The thing that actually saved London was not justice. It was building codes and insurance policies, the dull, unheroic work of admitting that the fault was in the system rather than in a stranger. That is the uncomfortable lesson under the monument. Risk almost never arrives as a villain. It accumulates quietly, one sensible decision at a time, until an ordinary Saturday night in a bakery is enough.